She stood at a fresh grave on the hill above her father's land in a black dress that had been her mother's, and she did not cry. Not because there was nothing left to feel, because by then she had already spent every tear she owned. 5 months earlier, on a gray Tuesday morning in May, she hadn't even known his name. But it started long before that Tuesday, on a morning so ordinary that if you'd told her it was the beginning of anything, she would have laughed and gone back to her churning. Eleanor Hargrove had a rule about strays. She fed them once, and after that, they were her responsibility. It was a rule that had cost her over the years in chicken feed and cornmeal, and the occasional worried look from Otis Greaves, who considered it a poor economy for a woman who could barely feed herself. That morning, she knelt by the woodpile with a heel of bread in her hand and coaxed the thin brown and white dog out from under the porch, the way she had every morning for 3 weeks since he'd shown up limping and half-starved at her gate. He took the bread gently, the way an animal takes food when it is learned, the hard way, that gentleness gets you fed again tomorrow. She scratched behind his torn ear and told him, the way she told most living things on that ranch, that he was going to have to earn his keep eventually. Then she stood, brushed the flour from her palms, and went back to work, because the sun didn't wait for anyone's tenderness, and neither, lately, did the Larkspur County Bank. Kansas in the spring of 1878 was still counting the cost of the drought that had broken so many families 4 years before, and the Hargrove Ranch, 11 miles outside the town of Larkspur, had never fully recovered from it. Her father, Edmund Hargrove, had borrowed against the land in a good year to buy breeding stock, certain the herd would double and the note would pay itself off inside a decade. Then came '74, and the grass burned brown by June, and half the herd sold at a loss just to keep the other half alive. Edmund had spent the rest of his life paying interest on a debt that never shrank, and 8 months ago, on a cold morning in September, his heart had simply stopped while he was mending the north fence, and Eleanor had found him there with a fence staple still in his hand. She had buried him on the hill next to the mother Eleanor barely remembered, gone since Eleanor was 9 years old, a fever that took 3 long weeks to finish what it started. And she had told herself, in the raw weeks after, that grief was a debt too, one you paid down slowly, a little every day, until one morning you noticed the balance was smaller than it used to be. She had not expected the bank's debt to come due at the same time as her own. The letter had arrived in April. Not from the bank exactly, from a man named Elias Pruitt, who signed himself branch manager, Larkspur County Bank, and who informed her, in language so formal it seemed designed to be misunderstood, that the note her father had taken against the ranch was 11 months in arrears on principal, and that the bank's obligations to its own investors required a full accounting of the property's condition and value before any further extension could be considered. An assessor would call. She should expect him within the month. Eleanor had read the letter twice, folded it along its old creases, and put it in the tin box on the mantel where she kept the things that mattered and the things that frightened her, which by that spring were often the same things. Then she had gone out and fed the dog, because some mornings that was the only decision small enough to make. There was one other letter she kept separately, in the pocket of her apron rather than the tin box, and she took it out again that evening by lamplight, though she had read it a dozen times already. It had come by way of the correspondence column of a Wichita newspaper, where nearly a year ago, in a moment of loneliness she was not proud of and had never told a living soul about, she had placed 3 sentences describing herself as a woman who worked hard, asked little, and wanted to hear from someone with a story of his own. A rancher from Nebraska named Thomas Reyes had answered her, and they had been writing ever since, long letters, unhurried, about cattle and weather and the particular ache of running land that had once belonged to someone else. She had never seen his face. She knew the slant of his handwriting better than she knew most of her neighbors' faces, and some nights that felt like a strange kind of luxury, a friendship with no expectations attached to it, arriving twice a month by stage, costing her nothing but 3 cents in postage and the trouble of being honest. She was still holding that letter when she heard a horse in the yard 3 weeks later on the gray Tuesday morning in May. The man who dismounted was younger than she expected a bank's assessor to be. 35 perhaps, tall and spare through the frame, with a leather satchel slung across one shoulder and the kind of watchful, unhurried manner of someone who had learned early not to waste movement. He introduced himself as Sam Whitlock, touched the brim of his hat exactly once, and told her, without apology, that he was there on behalf of the bank to assess the condition and productivity of the property. He did not ask to come in. He did not soften the purpose of his visit with small talk about the weather. He simply asked where she kept her cattle count and whether the well on the south quarter still ran in a dry summer, and wrote her answers down in a small ledger with an economy of motion that told her, more clearly than his words did, exactly how many of these visits he had made before, and to how many people who had lost everything at the end of them. She showed him the herd, the well, the fences her father had built with his own hands. She did not tell him she'd buried that man 8 months ago with a fence staple still in his palm. It was not, she told herself, any of the bank's business what the ranch had cost her. Whitlock wrote everything down and said very little, and when he rode out an hour later, Eleanor stood in the yard and watched him go and felt, more than anything, a kind of exhausted relief that it was over. It was not over. He came back 4 days later with more questions about water rights, about the herd's breeding records, about a boundary line that didn't match the county map. He was, if anything, more clipped than before, and Otis Greaves, who had worked this land since before Eleanor was born and had appointed himself her second set of eyes where strangers were concerned, watched the whole exchange from the barn door with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low. Man like that, Otis said afterwards, spitting to the side of the porch step, counts a thing twice before he trusts it once. Bank's got him counting you. He was quiet a moment, working a stem of grass between his teeth. Don't mean he likes the counting. Eleanor didn't answer that. She had noticed the same thing herself and decided it was safer not to think about what it meant. Whitlock came a third time at the end of that week, and this visit was different from the start. He arrived without his ledger. He stood in the yard a moment before he said anything at all, looking at the fence her father had mended the day he died. Otis had told him that much apparently in one of their exchanges by the barn, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the flat efficiency of his first 2 visits. I've seen 40 ranches like this one since March, he said. Most of them, the fences are falling down before the bank ever sends anyone to look at them. Yours aren't. He looked at her directly, which he had not done before. That's not something a ledger asks about. I wanted you to know I noticed. It was such a small thing to say, and it undid something in her she had not expected to have undone. She busied her hands with the wash she was hanging so he would not see her face, and said only, "My father built good fences." And he said, "I can tell." And for a moment neither of them said anything else, and the silence was not uncomfortable the way it had been on his first visit. It was something else. She did not have a word for it yet, and she was not in any hurry to find one, because a word would have made it a fact, and a fact would have made it a problem, and she had enough of those already. What she did not say, what she would not have said even under oath, was that she had started listening for hoofbeats on the road in a way she had not done for any other visitor in 8 months. She kept that fact folded as small and as private as the letter in her apron pocket, and if her hands went briefly still at the sound of a rider approaching, or if she found herself, without quite deciding to, wearing her mother's brooch on days she thought he might call, she told no one, and she told herself least of all. Sam Whitlock, for his part, had his own reasons for not saying anything either. He had grown up in an orphan asylum in Topeka and left it at 14 with nothing but a name that might or might not have been his father's, and every job he had held since then, he had held because he did the work without complaint and asked for nothing extra. Elias Pruitt had made it plain, in a closed office with the shades drawn, that the bank's new silent partners, a group of Eastern investors who had bought heavily into notes along the surveyed route of a proposed rail spur, wanted properties like the Hargrove Ranch cleared and consolidated before the year was out, and that Pruitt's own position depended on delivering exactly the kind of clean, unfavorable assessment that would let the bank foreclose without a fight. Sam had understood, writing out that first Tuesday, precisely what he had been sent to find. He had no family to fall back on if he refused the assignment, no cousin's farm to retreat to, no one at all in the whole wide state of Kansas who would notice if Sam Whitlock lost his position and simply moved on to the next town. It was not an excuse. He did not offer it to himself as one, but it was the truth, and the truth was that for 2 visits he had done the job he was sent to do. The 3rd visit changed that, and by the 4th, he had stopped pretending to himself that it hadn't. Back in town, Pruitt had grown impatient. He called Sam into his office the Monday after that third visit, closed the door, and asked without preamble whether the Hargrove assessment was ready to submit. When Sam said he needed another week, Pruitt's face did the thing it did when he was frightened rather than angry, a tightening around the eyes that had nothing to do with temper. "The investors expect the spur properties cleared by autumn," he said. "I don't have another week to give you, Whitlock, and neither, frankly, do you." He didn't say it as a threat. He said it the way a man states a fact he wishes were not true, and that somehow made it worse. Sam rode back out to the ranch 3 days later with no ledger and no good answer for what he meant to do about it, only the beginning of one. He came again the following week, and this time he brought no papers at all, and he told her, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, that he had gone back through the bank's own recording of her father's note and found something Pruitt had either missed or chosen not to mention, that Kansas banks in those years sometimes honored an unwritten custom, a year's grace on foreclosure for a landholder who could show provable drought damage if the claim was filed with the county recorder before the bank's notice went to publication. Pruitt had never filed it. Whether from carelessness or design, Sam didn't know and didn't much care. What mattered was that the claim still could be filed if someone moved quickly and if the bank's minimum interest payment for the year could somehow be met. "I can't file it as a friendly act," he told her. Pruitt would ask why a bank assessor is doing paperwork on behalf of the woman he's supposed to be assessing. "But I can file it as protection for the bank. Tell him the investors will have grounds to sue if it comes out later that the exemption wasn't offered when custom required it. He's frightened enough of his own investors to believe that. He doesn't need to believe anything else." "And the interest payment?" Eleanor asked, because she already knew, to the dollar, what she did not have. Sam was quiet a moment. "I have some put by," he said. 11 years of not spending money on much of anything. I'd rather spend it keeping a fair thing honest than leave it in a drawer." She wanted to refuse it. Some proud, careful part of her, the part that had learned young not to owe anyone anything she couldn't repay, wanted to tell him no, that she would find another way. But she thought of her father's hands on that fence, and Otis growing older every season with no one to help him but her, and the dog asleep by the woodpile who had nowhere else to go either. And she found that the word she actually said was, "Why would you do that?" "Because it's fair," he said, and it wasn't being honored. He put his hat back on. That's reason enough. It was not, she suspected, the whole reason. She let it stand anyway, because some doors are easier to leave closed than to walk all the way through. And she was not ready, that afternoon, to walk through this one. He filed the claim 2 days later, in Pruitt's office, with the calm, unhurried manner of a man reciting facts rather than making a request. And Pruitt, who understood liability the way other men understood scripture, signed the stay without argument once he grasped what a lawsuit from his own investors would cost him. The foreclosure notice, already drafted, went into a drawer instead of the county paper. Eleanor Hargrove had 1 year. She learned the news from Sam himself, who rode out to tell her in person rather than trust it to a letter. And when she understood what he was telling her, that the ranch was hers for another 12 months at least, that her father's fences would stand another winter under her own hand and no one else's, she did something she had not done since the morning she found her father in the north pasture. She cried openly in front of a near stranger, standing in her own yard with flowers still on her apron, and Sam Whitlock stood a respectful 3 feet away and let her, and did not try to make it smaller than it was. She insisted on cooking him supper the following Sunday by way of thanks, and he came at the appointed hour in a clean shirt with his hair combed flat, carrying a jar of peach preserves he'd bought in town, because he hadn't known what else a man brought to a supper like that. Otis ate with them and then made himself scarce with the diplomatic suddenness of a man who has decided 2 people need a porch to themselves, and Eleanor and Sam sat over coffee in the last of the evening light while the dog dozed at their feet. And for a little while it felt to both of them like something that might have a future. It was Sam who broke that feeling, gently and on purpose. He set his cup down and told her, without the careful economy he used for bank business, that in 11 years of moving from job to job and town to town, he had never once found a place or a person that made him want to stay put until this spring, until this ranch, until her. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, because he had decided, riding out that evening, that a thing worth saying was worth saying without dressing it up. Eleanor sat very still. She had known this was coming, in the way you know a storm is coming from the color of the sky, and she had spent 3 sleepless nights trying to decide what she would say when it did, and she still was not certain, when the moment arrived, that she had the right words for it. "Sam," she said finally, "you have been the kindest thing that has happened to this ranch since my father died, and I don't say that lightly." She reached across the table and took his hand, briefly, the way you take the hand of a brother. "I care for you. I want you to know that plainly, the way you say things plainly. But I care for you as a friend, and I think you deserve to hear that honestly, rather than have me let you hope for something else." Something moved behind his eyes, quick and controlled, the way a man's face moves when he has trained himself for years not to let disappointment show. He nodded once. "There's someone else," she went on, "because he deserved the whole truth and not a kindly edited version of it. A man I've never met. We've written to each other almost a year, a rancher out in Nebraska, name of Thomas Reyes. I don't know what it is exactly, except that I find myself thinking of him more than I probably should, or a man whose face I couldn't pick out of a crowd." She looked down at their hands, still joined on the table between them. "I wanted to tell you the truth, Sam. You've earned that much and more." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was even, the old clipped efficiency back in place like a door pulled shut. "Then I'm glad," he said, "that you told me. And I wish you every happiness you're owed, which by my count is considerable." He stood and took his hat from the table and did not let go of her hand until he had said, "Thank you for the supper, Eleanor, and for the honesty. Both were finer than I deserved." She walked him to his horse. He mounted, touched his hat brim once more the way he had the very first morning, and said nothing else, because there was nothing else that would have helped either of them. Then he turned the horse toward the Larkspur Road and rode out at a hard, fast pace into the falling dark, faster than the road really allowed, the way a man rides when he needs the wind to explain the water in his eyes. He was 3 miles from the ranch, at the narrow bend where the road dipped through a dry creek bed, when the stray dog, her stray dog, out roaming farther than he had any business roaming, bolted across the road directly under the horse's front legs. Sam did not think. He wrenched the reins hard to the side, the same instinct that would have made him swerve for a child or a calf, and the horse's shoulder went out from under him on the loose creek gravel. He was thrown clear, and the fall itself was not so very far, and for one long moment afterward the evening was completely silent, the way evenings are silent right before someone realizes something has gone terribly wrong. Otis found him an hour later, when the horse came back to the ranch alone, reins trailing, and by the time Otis reached the creek bed with a lantern, there was nothing left to do but sit with him and send for the doctor from town, who could only confirm what the stillness had already told them, and ride back in the dark to wake Eleanor with the kind of news that changes the shape of a person permanently. They buried Sam Whitlock 5 days later on a hill outside Larkspur, because he had no family plot anywhere in the world to carry him home to, and Eleanor Hargrove stood at the graveside in her mother's black dress and did not cry, because by then she had already cried every tear she had, alone, in the 5 days between his death and his funeral, and there was nothing left in her for the public part of grief. Otis stood beside her with his hat over his heart. Pruitt came too, stiff and pale, and saying almost nothing, and if there was guilt in his silence, no one asked him to explain it, and he offered none on his own. The year moved forward, after that the way years do after a loss, not gently exactly, but steadily, the way a wound closes over even when the thing underneath it never fully heals. Eleanor kept the ranch running through that summer and the hard winter that followed, kept the fences mended, kept the dog fed, kept the letters to Thomas Reyes arriving twice a month like clockwork, because they were increasingly the only correspondence in her life that didn't remind her of a debt. She told him eventually about Sam, not everything, but enough. And Thomas wrote back with a gentleness that surprised her and did not try to fill the silence where her grief lived with anything but patience. She had believed, in the quiet arithmetic she did some nights by lamplight, that the year Sam had bought her would be enough to see her through, that by the time the grace period expired, the herd would have recovered, the note would be smaller, and she would find some way to keep making the payments a season at a time, the way her father had for years before her. She had not accounted for what happens to an informal protection when the one man who understood how to enforce it was no longer there to do it. Pruitt's Eastern investors, freed by then of the pressure Sam had once put on them, moved to consolidate the rail spur properties before the year's grace had even fully lapsed, and the new notice, cold, correct, entirely within its rights, arrived in April, almost exactly a year after the first one. She recognized the envelope before she opened it. That was the strange part, the part she hadn't expected. Not fear, not even surprise, just a kind of tired recognition. The first notice, all those months ago, had frightened her the way new things frighten you, with the particular sharp edge of not knowing yet how bad it could get. This one only made her sit down at the kitchen table and read it twice, slowly, the way you'd read something already knowing what it said. She found herself, absurdly, wishing she had someone to hand it to, the way she used to hand hard things to her father, or, for one brief spring, to Sam. There was no one at the table now but the dog, who put his chin on her knee as if he understood there was a shape to grief, even when he couldn't read the words that caused it. She had 1 week to vacate the only home she had ever known. A week is a strange unit to measure a life by. Too little time in the ordinary sense, but also, in a way she didn't say out loud to anyone, exactly enough time to grieve something she'd already been grieving in installments for a year. She had lost her father in September. She had lost Sam in May. She supposed she was only losing the house in April because the paperwork had taken that long to catch up to what she'd already understood, somewhere underneath the daily chores, since the morning Otis came up the dark road with a riderless horse. She spent that week the way you spend a week like that, packing what could be packed, giving away what couldn't, standing longer than she needed to in doorways that had held her whole life. She found her father's old ledgers in the bottom drawer of his desk, the columns of his careful handwriting, recording 30 years of calves, born and hay cut, and debts chipped slowly away, and she sat on the floor of his empty study for the better part of an hour before she could make herself close the drawer and move on to the next room. In a trunk beneath the window, she found the few things that had been her mother's: a hairbrush, a hymnal, a keepsake, or two she barely remembered handling. She had been 9 when her mother died, young enough that the grief for her had mostly turned into something quieter over the years, a room in the house of herself she visited rarely. She visited it now for a few minutes, and then folded those few things into a shawl and packed them the way you pack anything you intend to keep carrying. She thought of Sam more than she let herself say that week, not the last evening, worn smooth by now from turning it over so many times, but the ordinary visits, the ledger, the fence he'd noticed. She found herself wondering whether the year he'd bought her had been worth what it cost him, and decided, somewhere in that long, quiet afternoon, to carry the question with her rather than resolve it. Some debts, she was learning, were not meant to be paid down to nothing. They were only meant to be carried well. Otis helped her load the wagon on the second to last day, working slower than he used to, and pretending not to notice that he was. He told her in the same gruff tone he used for everything that mattered to him that he'd go stay with a cousin 2 counties over and find work there. He was too old, he said, to start again from nothing on someone else's land. He stood a long moment at the gate before he left, looking back at the house and the barn and the fence Edmund Hargrove had built with his own hands, and Eleanor understood, without either of them saying it, that he would have stayed forever if the choice had been his to make. "Your pa would be proud of how you fought for this place," he told her, not quite looking at her when he said it. Fighting and losing ain't the same as not fighting at all. It was the closest either of them came to speaking Sam's name that week, and she understood that too, that Otis meant more than the bank. She thanked him the only way he'd have accepted it, which was plainly, without ceremony, and watched him walk the road until the dust in the distance took him from sight. The dog, at least, came with her. That much she would not negotiate, not after everything the small, stubborn creature had already cost and been worth. She had thought, in the first raw days after the accident, that she might not be able to look at him without seeing the road and the dark. Instead, she found the opposite was true. He was the last living creature on that ranch who had loved Sam Whitlock even a little, in his own simple animal way. And she was not about to leave that behind along with everything else. On the last evening before she was to leave, With the wagon half loaded and the house already beginning to feel like someone else's, the mail rider came up the darkening road with the twice-monthly delivery from town. And among the ordinary business of the county was a letter from Nebraska, in the handwriting she had come to know as well as her own. She did not open it right away. She sat with it a moment first, turning it over in her hands the way she might turn over a coin, before deciding whether to spend it. Because some part of her, the part that had learned twice now in 8 months exactly how much a person could lose, was afraid of what hoping again might cost her. A year of letters had taught her the particular shape of Thomas Reyes's sentences, the way he circled a feeling for a page and a half before he let himself say it plainly. She thought, briefly and without meaning to, of Sam standing in this same yard with his hat in his hands, and let the thought pass through her the way she had learned to let such thoughts pass, acknowledged, not fought, not lingered on. She sat on the porch step by the last of the light to read it, the dog's head heavy against her knee. And Thomas Reyes's letter said, in the plain, unhurried way all his letters said things, that he had been thinking for months about what it would mean to stop being pen and paper to each other and start being something else, and that he could no longer, in good conscience, let the woman he had come to care for more than he'd expected to face, losing her home with an ocean of prairie between them and nothing but ink to offer her. He wrote that he had almost said it a dozen times before and lost his nerve, because a letter cannot see your face when you ask it a question that matters, and a man likes to know what he's asking before he asks it. He asked her, in words that were careful and a little formal and entirely sincere, to come to Nebraska, to marry him if she was willing, and to let him give her a home that no bank could take from her, on land that would be, from the day she arrived, as much hers as his. Eleanor read it once, and then again, and somewhere in the second reading she found herself laughing and crying at the same time, in the particular way grief and joy sometimes arrive together and refuse to be separated. She thought, just once, of Sam, not with guilt, but with something close to gratitude, for a man who had given her a year she was now, in a roundabout way, about to spend. She pressed the letter to her lips, the way you'd thank a thing for arriving exactly when it was needed, and then she folded it along its new crease and went inside to finish packing, because there was, suddenly, a great deal more to pack for than she had planned that morning, and a great deal more reason to hurry. She left 2 mornings later. Not by wagon. The railroad had reached Larkspur the year before, the same line the bank's investors had wanted her land for, and now it was the fastest way out of Kansas a person could buy a ticket for, fast and cheap and with no room on board for a dog. She rode out to the cousin's place herself to tell Otis, the dog trotting alongside the borrowed horse the whole way there. She found the old man mending a fence that wasn't his yet, the same way he'd mended 100 that were. He didn't ask why she'd come. He looked at the dog, then at her, and said, "Leave him. He knows me." It was the easiest goodbye of the whole hard month, because it was the only one that came with a promise instead of a loss. She knelt down and let the dog lick her chin once, then got back on the horse before she could change her mind about any of it. The train left Larkspur Station at 9 the next morning. 1 bag, 1 ticket, 1 letter read so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. Kansas slid past the window for the better part of a day, the same flat gold country she'd known her whole life, moving faster than any horse had ever carried her away from it. And somewhere past the state line she finally let herself sleep, properly, for the first time in a week. She woke to a conductor calling the name of a town she had never seen, in a state she had never visited, to meet a man she had never met. She smoothed her skirt, picked up her bag, and stepped down onto the platform. The first person walking toward her was not him. Eleanor didn't know it yet. Thank you for spending time with me today. If this story touched you about the price of doing the right thing or the strange timing of the letters that saved us, I hope you'll join me again. A train has just pulled into a station in Nebraska, and the first person to walk toward Eleanor isn't the man she came to meet. Consider subscribing so you don't miss the next episode. Until then, keep the light on the porch.